The Baroque era was a very odorous era. The canals of Venice were one large open sewer. This is only surprising because it was an age famed for its ostentation. Today, unimaginable, washing is frowned upon. However, at the time, the industry of perfume did not lay in Paris in France. It was instead the old trading city of Venice that produced a perfumer offering a totally new scent to the aristocratic world of the 1800s, Giovanni Maria Farina. Was Süskind inspired by Farina's life story to write his world-famous novel Perfume? The rulers of the world had succumbed to Farina's perfume, which was indeed gold-worthy. A perfume that went down in history. How much of this history is to be found in Süskind's novel, and can we still find traces of Farina's legacy in the present? It's the year 1709 as the first customer for Farina's perfume is written into the secret book of the family business. It's also the same year that he founds the company of the same name, a company that until this day remains in the hands of the family. His revolutionary scent is a tribute to his new hometown of Cologne. He calls it Eau de Cologne. Farina's list of customers stands as a who's who of the Baroque era and the new Rococo era. Princes and princesses, kings and queens, emperors and empresses. There is nearly no one of note that had not ordered it after being overcome by the scent. Among them also artists such as Voltaire, Goethe and Mozart. Even the French Revolution could not sweep away the odour of the ancient regime. Napoleon allegedly ordered the fragrance in litres, in small bottles that he could slide in on the inside of his boots. Farina's success story was indeed the stuff of fairy tales. For this reason, I suspect that Süskind's inspiration was Farina. However, the story of this gifted composer of scents begins not in the stinking fish market in Paris as the story of Grenouille, the murderer of Süskind's novel, but in the idyllic settings of the sweet-smelling climes of northern Italy's mountains. To be exact, in Piedmont in the valley of Vigezzo, above Lake Maggiore, in a town that was co-founded by his ancestors in the 1500s, Santa Maria Maggiore. The Farinas saved themselves from the plague of Ancona in the clean, healthy air of the mountains. In piety and thanks to God, they donated freely to the town over generations. And it was in this simple rural world that Giovanni Farina was born. Here is the house in which he was born on December the 8th, 1685, when he first saw the light of day and the first time that he smelt his surroundings. Even as a small boy, Giovanni hated the bad smells of the ordinary people's homes, the overcooked cabbage or the pungent body odours. He tried to spend as much time as possible away from the village. The Farinas did not belong to the poorer society, those who lived in small houses where the combined stench of an entire family remained in the one shared room. Nevertheless, he did have to visit them. The stink was overbearing for this sensitive boy with his finely tuned olfactory senses. It was like a flawed note to a highly trained musical ear.
First, part of our life is the most important part, what smell and smelling and nose concern. The first moment in life when you smell a smell is the essential moment, and that remains the source of that specific smell for the rest of your life. So when you smell something, that moment, that context, the mood of that context, the emotion of that context, be it positive or negative, will then be your relation to that smell for the rest of your life. So childhood is very, very important for smell and smelling. So later in life, you just remember that very moment. And it's hard to change your relation to the smell.
But for Giovanni, not everything smells bad. He's captivated by the fresh, bloomy scent of the springtime in the Italian mountains, which later became the note that would distinguish his legendary perfume. The pinkster lily, also known as mountain narcissus, impregnating the spring air. It is a scent that strengthens the self-assurance. Narcissus. The name comes from a figure in Greek mythology which was turned into a flower. Narcissus, who fell desperately in love with his own mirror image. Also Süskind's lonely monster leaves the city for the smell of the remote mountains, albeit setting the scented meadows in the south of France. Giovanni loves these flowers that give off their heady sweet fragrance across the fields throughout the months of April and May. This smell not only permeates Giovanni's life from his childhood on, it is exactly this smell that would inspire his revolutionary perfume, which would be the key to his success.
In my work, that is where I concentrate most, to try to trigger children at a very early stage in life to also use the nose for the purpose to perceive their surrounding full time. You know, by understanding the surrounding with the nose, you understand a much more fundamental and much deeper and you remember it for much longer time. And I think it's important, you know, we are tired of the look of things. It's all about look, look, look. We understand, let's say, the issue of environmental, you know, issues and questions much more deep if we understand it with our noses.
Nous avons tous des souvenirs d'enfance.
We all carry these memories from childhood with us, and all of them are connected scents as well. But these scent associations throughout the childhood happen so quickly that we are unconscious of their existence. In the case of Gabrielle Chanel, we know she was brought up in a very strict environment. Also in regards to her olfactory senses, an environment that was very strict, very clear and very pure. This pureness and clarity was what she aimed to reproduce in her perfume.
Cette sensation de propreté, de simplicité dans son environnement olfactif.
Coco Chanel managed to create probably the most famous perfume in the world to this day. One can also find in Coco Chanel's autobiography parallels to Süskind's fictional main character. Jean-Baptiste Grenouille retreats to an isolated cave in the Orient before moving to Grasse. Chanel also lived as a poor orphan in a convent in Orient. Her experiences there were the inspiration for her later creations. In devout regions, frankincense and myrrh are smells that infuse the landscape, with its churches, monasteries, and the pilgrimage sites. Giovanni was also influenced by the smells of the church. The Vigezzo Valley is also home to the famous pilgrimage site of Vraie. At the age of only 14, Giovanni had to turn his back on the smells of his childhood as he embarked on his grand tour, a rite of passage that all young men of good background had to undertake at the time. He not only had to leave his parents, but also the trusted smells that had accompanied him throughout his childhood. His first destination was Venice, and already on his way discovers new smells for his senses. The water now does not smell as pure as the fresh springs he'd smelt as he grew up. Here the water was brackish and had to be boiled before it was fit for consumption. A kettle was hung over the fire constantly. Drinkable water has always been one of life's essentials. Herbs are not only the medicine of this age, they enhance the smell and taste of the cooked water. Melissa has a calming effect, stinging nettles are used to cleanse the system, mint is used for its healing and fortifying properties. All of these smells are beneficial to Giovanni's growing olfactory senses. It is the time of the generic miracle water, eau admirable. Fragrant herbs and flower extracts are intended not only for external use, but especially internal usage. Giovanni would learn more about such matters during his time in Venice. In 1699, Giovanni finally arrived in the town built on a lagoon, Venice. It was his first sensory experience of life in a big city. Sadly, not everything smelled good here, in this town where the faces hide behind masks most of the year. The sewage and feces of the houses and palaces run unfiltered directly into the countless channels of the city. This potent brackish cocktail eats away at the very stone of the buildings. But the tides mean that the smells have a certain regularity, and high tide brings the fresh smell of the sea.
Venice is very, due to the humidity, it's very damp, very wet, I think. It was a muddy smell and wet stone.
In Giovanni's time, the smells of Venice were far more multifaceted. At the time, Venice was the gateway to the rich and opulent Orient. The lush splendor of the Serenissima, or the most serene Republic of Venice, is untouched by the suffering of the time as wars rage across the rest of Europe. A touch of the exotic permeates the air as the wares of the New World are brought to this land hub. Spices and rare essences from the Orient join the array of odors of the city. Venice was then, as it is now, a city of pleasures. For those who could afford it, the city offered its famous carnivals. Members of the bourgeois, nobility, and the clergy thronged to the city from all over Europe. It's not only class barriers that were broken down behind the masks, but also inhibitions. The intoxication of this extravagant joviality gives wings to all the senses. Venice is not only a firework display of large and small vanities, but also a melting pot for creative minds, an inspiration for artists of every type. It is in particular a great inspiration for the perfumers' fine noses. They may not be able to see who is behind the mask, but they can smell them. Later, Coco Chanel also took inspiration from the splendorous Baroque flourishes of the Serenissima, in particular Venice's palaces. Giovanni reads the faces and masks like a book. He observes and inhales his surroundings with his fine nose. He lets the city wash over his senses, as did Coco Chanel, and later translates his olfactory impressions to paper.
Venice
is a hugely inspiring city, filled with mysticism and symbolism. Take the Lion of St. Mark, the famous winged lion, which symbolizes the holiness, the gospel according to Mark. As a symbol of the Venetian colonies, it combines and incorporates the sense of the world, the wealth and the luxury. It was this that inspired Coco Chanel. The majestic and sublime winged lion is omnipresent throughout the entire city. The opulent and exuberant Venice of Baroque times is reflected in the Italian literature of the time. Giovanni Farina, Coco Chanel, and Patrick Süskind all find their fantasies inspired by the writings of this scented city. Like Giovanni, Coco Chanel wrote meticulous notes about her impressions of Venice. It was also her inspiration for her world-famous Chanel No. 5 perfume. The coffee houses of Venice were very characteristic of the city in Farina's time. Then, as now, They are the meeting place for intellectuals and artists. Giovanni Farina also spent his time here, as did later customers for his Cologne house of perfume. Among them, Casanova, Goethe, Lord Byron and Balzac. It's no surprise. The coffee houses were not only an expression of the sign of the times, but also a great neutralizer of the less palatable smells. Café Florian was one of the first of its kind in Europe and exists to this very day, 300 years later. The original atmosphere is still palpable through its luxurious Baroque interior, especially during the city's carnival season. Coffee houses like Florian were a development at the end of the 17th century. The hot beverage of the Ottoman Empire had been primarily used for medicinal purposes. As much as the cafes spread across the city at the time, so did the range of perfumes. Heady odours such as amber, musk, sandalwood and civet were very much in fashion at the time. It was from such oriental spices that Giovanni's great uncle Carlos Gennari had produced his perfumes for the elite of Venice. Gennari's so-called miracle waters, eaux admirables, were no less in demand. One smell and one was enticed to smell as good. Gennari's scented products came in all forms and spread throughout the people of the city. Whether it be a scented powder, scented salts or fragrant oils, the citizens of Venice were catered from head to toe. It was from his great uncle that Giovanni learnt the tools of his trade from scratch. It was here that he discovered what was obstructing the pure smell of mountain narcissi, all the carrier substances in perfumes of the day which carried their own distinctive smell. Giovanni's learning starts with incenses. He's inquisitive and quick to learn. Everything is defined by his sense of smell, similar to Süskind's autistic main character Grenouille. Good and evil, love and sorrow. His keen perception detects subtle nuances, and he pragmatically learns the science of alchemy, something the more modern scientists will soon discard. He absorbs all around with a deep breath. His apprenticeship is an odor-intense journey through the history of perfume. Perfumum is Latin for by means of smoke.
The history of scents is the history of humankind. For example, the ancient Egyptians influenced the entirety of the Western culture of fragrance. Fragrances were seen as an essential element of life. They were not only used in communication with the gods and as a form of protection against illness, but also mixed with oil as protection against the sun and for seduction, of course.
There already existed a blooming perfume industry under the rule of the pharaohs. Lilies, roses and hyacinths. Flowers and herbs were already utilized as a means of producing scents. Even the Egyptian mummies were embalmed with their own individual fragrances. Most of the precious, oil-based essences were preserved in the finest alabaster. It wasn't only the Egyptians who produced unisex fragrances. In contrast to Farina's Baroque era, washing and bathing were everyday rituals in antiquity. It was only the cleanly body that was further embellished with fragrance. It was never used as a smokescreen. Antique flacons were also increasingly seen as a status symbol. But preferences of scent change over time. The Baroque period saw the closure of numerous public baths by the church. Body odours became penetrant, and as a result, the perfumes became intenser. The taste of the times was for ever more elaborate receptacles. Embellishment was the order of the day. Perfume bottles made from Morano glass were considered to be the epitome of luxury. His glass production was protected as a state secret by the Venetian Republic. Until the growth of porcelain in the 18th century, Morano glass was seen as the most precious man-made material for all sorts of receptacles. In an effort to protect the city from the fires of the blazing glass ovens, glass production was moved to the offshore island of Morano. Glassblowers still work on the island to this day, producing handmade products from the precious material. One of the best kept and most treasured secrets of the island was the composition of multicolored glass. Betrayal of the secret was a crime punishable by death. However, the glass industry didn't only produce luxurious colors and forms, but also its own particular odors. Giovanni Farina loved Morano. He philosophized about the smells here as he stopped by the glassblowers. Is it the smell of the scented wood that obscures the smell of the glassblower's sweat, or is it the fresh seawater that makes the odor of the craftsman seem more palatable? As with Süskind's protagonist, Giovanni becomes obsessed with the smell of his fellow citizens, smells that he files away in his brain like a precious scent in a Morano flacon. And there is another who shares this passion, Louis XIV, the Sun King. His spies manage to uncover the mystery of Morano glass. Soon after, his private workshops in Versailles begin to produce the precious glass to house the perfume produced by his private perfumer. One cannot ignore the contribution of Versailles in the history of perfume. But before Versailles, there was the rule of Catherine de' Medici. Catherine imported essences and scents from Italy before the Sun King Louis XIV. In 1540, she personally oversaw the opening of the very first house of perfume in Paris. Coco Chanel held the Queen in very high regard for her introduction and establishment of Italian Renaissance to the royal courts of France. Chanel has even paid tribute to the Queen in copying aspects of her fashion. Even Coco Chanel's double C in her logo was a direct tribute to the Medicis. She studied passionately the fonts of the age and the styles and fashion, and felt herself connected to Catherine through their shared passion for perfume. As a fashion designer, she produced sleek elegance combined with luxurious materials as a contrast to the playful style of Art Deco, an age as spirited and ornate as that of Baroque or Rococo. It is now that Giovanni Farina makes his first entrance to the opulent world of the ballrooms, the stage for the world of elegance. But even the finest garments and the most refined manners cannot cover up the bitter odors of nobility and citizens, of servants and peasants. The heavily perfumed smell of the unwashed collective is one that Farina can never get used to.
Dans la période de la Renaissance, juste après le Moyen Âge,
public bathing houses were forbidden in the Renaissance times, directly after the Middle Ages. Bathing or washing was seen to be the root of cause for numerous maladies. Instead, rooms would be filled with scented smoke, and the people would wear perfumed jewelry to shield themselves from the smell of others, and as a protection against illness.
Des fumigations que l'on fait dans les maisons pour se protéger contre les odeurs de l'autre et contre les maladies.
A lack of hygiene and the stink of it all was not only something ordained by the clergy. Doctors also advised against washing because water carried diseases. Even the elaborate clothing of the nobles was never washed because of the delicate materials. Undergarments were also not commonplace. Powder, sweat, and body oils permeated the material of outer garments, making the unpleasant odor a constant. It is no surprise that even the most noble materials became a breeding ground for insects. that these parasites would carry disease was not as yet known. There were constantly new perfumes in an attempt to cover up the disagreeable stench. Citrus fruits were known to be a refreshment and a proven remedy for the illnesses of the time. During the plague, they had worked near miracles. Not many perfumers had yet discovered the value of these fruits, as Giovanni Farina realized their infinite possibilities. Giovanni discovered a particular fruit which he began to use, the bergamot. Farina's greatest innovation was the usage of this newly discovered raw material, the bergamot, which had been recently cultivated. It was a period that saw the near domination of lemons and oranges as fruits and ornamental plants in the royal courts of Europe. Giovanni researched the many nuances of these exotic fruits. He now has a feeling that he wants to be a perfumer, and like Grenouille and Coco, he wants to create something totally new. For this, he had to first create the right technical conditions. What Farina brings new to the whole equation was new technical conditions, in particular the distillation of pure alcohol and that the alcohol remained pure. You have to imagine that in many cases the purchased alcohol retained the smell from which it had been produced. The art of distillation was also something that had been imported from the Orient. In Venice, the alchemists refined and perfected the process. It was a fundamental but imperative process that every perfumer had to be able to execute perfectly. It was the last blooming of alchemy in the Baroque era before the more scientific practices of chemistry and pharmaceutics took over. Distillation is the process of separating different elements of a liquid by heating them. Even the miracle waters, the eaux admirables, were made with this production technique with distillation. Many alchemists harbored noble intentions with their miracle waters, which were effective and therefore popularly used as a medicine. It's no wonder that the symbols for alchemy would later be used as the symbols used by pharmacies. An important development is already underway as Giovanni came to Venice at the turn of the 18th century. Alchemists became the modern natural scientists, physicists, chemists, and pharmacists. Suddenly, different methods and techniques were being contemplated and refined with ever-increasingly sophisticated apparatus. Giovanni produces an alcohol so pure that even his fine nose is satisfied. A pure, natural-smelling alcohol, which would become the prerequisite for all of his later compositions. Something totally new. Until then, all perfumes had been oily or more solid like an ointment. But Giovanni, like Süskind's figure Grenouille, wanted to create a perfume that would amaze the entire world with its components. It shouldn't have the smell of wheat or plums. Giovanni gained the necessary knowledge from books, the same books perhaps that Patrick Süskind must have read later. Süskind makes reference to one particular book, Lettre odorosa by Magalotti to the Duke of Florence, which also describes a man who possesses no natural odor like Grenouille and then can differentiate the smells impartially.
Als unparteiischer quasi ergründen konnte.
After having absorbed all the books and with a plenitude of new fragrances in his nose, Giovanni leaves Venice. He continues to explore the other scents on offer from around the world. In a letter to his grandmother, he wrote, "How different is Rome with its enormous empty buildings and endless cobbled streets that are so dusty as to tickle the nose. Nothing evokes the splendor of Venice." Giovanni's travels take him across Europe, often passing the central hub of Switzerland and along the Lake of Geneva, passing on the way the huge and gloomy castle of Chillon until he eventually reaches the south of France. Finally, Giovanni Farina reaches Grasse, the setting for the hideous crimes of Grenouille, although Süskind rather describes the close-by Gouda for the arrival of his perfumer. At the end of the wide basin, perhaps 2 miles off, a town lay among, or better clung to, the rising mountains. The book continues. Although the sea was so near that one could see it from the top of the hills, there was nothing maritime. One does indeed have a view of the Côte d'Azur from Gouda, as well as a view of Grasse, which lies next to a fortress in the valley. When Farina arrived in Grasse, perfumers were seen more as travelling salesmen. A statue at the entrance to the old city pays tribute to this fact. Grasse wasn't so important for Farina. Farina was more important for Grasse. Grasse was known more as a trading city and not for what was grown here. As such, when Farina began here, Grasse was limited in sales and production areas. When Süskind sends his ingenious murderer to Grasse, the first perfume factory had just opened its doors. The city of tanners becomes a city of perfumers. The city can look back on 1,000 years of history, but it was only after the ordinance by the perfume-obsessed Sun King that it became the metropolis for perfume. In the previous centuries, Grasse had become famous for its leather tanneries. Its location on the slopes of the Estoril Mountains made it a natural location. Numerous springs still bubble up across the city to this day. Vast amounts of fresh water were used by the tanners for their hides. The skins had to be first cleaned before they were tanned, and then conserved with alkalis. It was everything else but a fragrant industry, as the dangerous chemical compounds seeped through the winding streets. Even the finest gloves produced here still carried the reek of the urine-filled mordant pools. This was deeply unsatisfactory for the elegant customers. Leather skins were hung out to dry all over, in between the closely built houses. For Süskind's character Grenouille, the pungent smell of ammonia was very comforting. It was a smell from his childhood. As the book says, it was a familiar odour to him. It gave him a sense of security. In every city, he always sought out the tanning district first. And that in Grasse was Place aux Heures, in the centre of the historic district. This was where Süskind's Grenouille sits to eat before he carries out his murderous plan at the gates to Grasse. There the fragrant fields stretched out before the eye, thanks to the efforts of the Sun King. Not only did he further the cause of the perfume industry that exists until this day, but he ordered and promoted the cultivation of roses, jasmine, and other perfumed plants. Jasmine was imported to the south of France from Asia in the 17th century. The first fields were planted next to Grasse. Farina became infatuated with the bouquet of this exotic plant and used it extensively and substantially as a component of his perfumes, just as Coco Chanel did later with her famous No. 5 perfume. Today she still has the jasmine specially grown and treated in Grasse. Again, Süskind used it as an important factor in his novel.
Patrick
Süskind was inspired for his book by the life of Giovanni Maria Farina. All of the components used for his marvelous Eau de Cologne appear in Süskind's book. Farina was the very first to combine the different citrus scents in countless variations, their leaves, the fruit, and the blossom. But there was another flower that featured in Süskind's perfume, the rose, the queen of all flowers and byword for beauty and femininity. The rose had already been cultivated for its aroma in ancient times. In Grasse, it has become a symbol because the fields stretched out until the horizon, bestowing the town people with an air of prosperity. It is exclusively the 100-leaved Provence rose, the Rosa centifolia, that is harvested in the milder climate of the Côte d'Azur. Its fragrance, according to recent scientific findings, can aid in peaceful sleep and cure headaches. Rose fragrance. The fragrance of the goddess of love Aphrodite hangs heavy in the air over the fields as Süskind's Grenouille commits his first murder for his perfume. In May of that same year, the naked body of a 15-year-old girl was found in a rose field, halfway between Grasse and the hamlet of Opio, east of town. The fictional murderer steals the scent of the dead girl by use of pig's fat. This was the normal method formerly used to extract the essence from petals. Grenouille seems to be obsessed by the so-called enfleurage process. Süskind goes into great detail about this methodology of extracting an essence by use of fat. The petals don't have to be heated up, which would possibly destroy the sensitive composition of the petals and harmonic mixture ratio of the individual components. The bitter remnant smell of the pig's fat is negligible against the fragrance of the rose as long as tanned leather is impregnated with the smell. But on the skin, if one wants to get closer to one's beloved? In contrast to Grenouille, Farina prefers the smell of the mountain herbs and uses distillation to extract the basic components for his fragrances. Giovanni Farina learns to work with new apparatus, not only for the distillation of alcohol, but also for the distillation of essential oils. With this process, it is the steam that extracts the aromatic molecules from the plants. As it cools down, the molecules separate from the water through condensation. The essential oils are brought to the surface as an essence on the so-called hydrolate, the condensed water. It was during Farina's time that the market for these essences became increasingly popular. Men were particularly interested in them, above all when their scent was heavy, sweet, and oily. Farina's refreshing scented waters based upon an odor-free alcohol was something totally new. As was his usage of citrus fruits. Until that time, they had only been used as a medicine, and the peel then discarded as waste. Giovanni was the first to produce a fragrant perfume from them, combining them with a bouquet of herbs and petals to produce an even richer and more aromatic scent, impossible to imagine at the beginning of the 18th century. Initially, the first customers were skeptical. Yes, the smell of orange blossom and neroli oil and water were known and much sought after. They were, after all, used by the Sun King by the litre, but an extract from a bowl? Still, Giovanni Farina had not succeeded in perfecting his most significant creation. However, he had established the refreshing basic note, and it is along these lines that he will continue. Now, 5 years after setting off on his grand tour, the boy has become a man, one with a clearly defined goal in mind, one who won't be deterred from his path. Now he moves perfectly at home in the company of the big city. He is vehemently opposed to his parents' plan to take up a business apprenticeship in Maastricht. But initially unsuccessful, it seems probable that he has no choice but to become a businessman. However, Giovanni uses every opportunity to promote and extol his talents as a perfumer. And for that, he had exactly the right nose for the jovial and easygoing age of Rococo. And with his nose, he is extremely successful. His creations sell very well all over. Now, his parents relent. In the meantime, his older brother Baptiste has opened a shop for luxury items and cologne. The shop is still standing after 300 years, in no small part thanks to the perfume of Giovanni, and that needed more than simply a good nose. One has to contemplate it's not enough simply to have a good nose. One also has to have the creativity to produce something new. Therefore, this is often more important than the sense of smell itself, because it is only the creative mind that can conjure up such a fragrance. It is exactly this creativity with which Farina has been bestowed. As with all artists, ideas grow and develop above all in the head. The perfumer writes down his recipes, constantly returning to refine them. He hangs on to his vision of the perfect fragrance, the emotions that it should evoke, and which feelings the smells of his surrounding environment induced. Many impressions are conjured together by his recipe. Finally, he's totally satisfied and sets off to Cologne with his new fragrance. Most of all the smells of his childhood inspired Farina's fantasy. In 1708, he writes to his brother, "I have created a fragrance that reminds me of a spring morning in Italy, just after it's rained. The mountain narcissi, the orange blossoms, bergamot, and the herbs of my home. It refreshes me and strengthens my senses." And then, of course, there are other components, such as sandalwood, musk, and also a touch of incense and other herbs like lavender. This was the beginning of a long and successful story. Depending on which country he found himself in, Giovanni would change his name to Johann or Jean. He uses his recipe as his financial deposit as he joins his brother as partner in his luxury goods store in Cologne. Did Baptiste realize the value of what he was holding in his hands as he accepted Giovanni's deal? Giovanni's recipe was eventually to be the success of the Farinas in Cologne. In the style of the miracle water of Eau Admirable, Giovanni, or now Jean, decides to name his most significant creation after the city where he will go into production, Eau de Cologne. Jean and Baptiste, and the perfume that will conquer the world. It is no accident that Süskind's Grenouille carries the first names of Jean-Baptiste. Jean-Baptiste Grenouille, the man that invents a perfume that sends the inhabitants of the marketplace of Grasse into realms of ecstasy. The people of Cologne were indeed intoxicated by the perfume of Jean and Baptiste, but not so many could afford it. In contrast to today, there wasn't an extensive customer base for expensive perfumes. Perfumes in general were extremely expensive. There's no comparison to now. One must consider that in 1720 a bottle of Eau de Cologne costed 1 Reichstaler, and in France 36 louis d'or. That meant it was a luxury product that few could afford. To put that into context, that was about the monthly wage for craftsmen, including apprentices and everything else. This was a product only for the very well-heeled citizens, but mainly for nobility. One had only succeeded when an influential opinion leader became a customer. At the time, it was above all the patronage of the French king and his court. Louis XV made an order, and then all the other crowned heads of Europe followed suit. Later, the fragrance of new lightness was also to waft through the halls of Sanssouci, ordered by Frederick the Great, who had a foible for the French style of life. His friend, the philosopher Voltaire, often visited him there. He wrote that the fragrance had managed to cover up the smell of tobacco smoke. Despite the forbidding price of the lavishly produced Eau de Cologne, Frederick the Great ordered vast amounts. It was reported at the time that he could hardly wait for his delivery from Cologne. The small shop in Cologne transformed into a company operating Europe-wide. The news of this unique and revolutionary fragrance spread like wildfire from court to court. There were few royal households that could resist the fragrance of the age. That one was continually delivering to these courts meant that one became a quasi-purveyor to the courts. The rich bourgeois across the land also wanted to imitate the nobility. Even critical minds would be infected by the sweeping euphoria. Even the quibbling Voltaire could not restrain his praise. Finally, a fragrance that doesn't stick to your body, but instead gives flight to your spirits. Süskind also sets his Jean-Baptiste Grenouille in this era that is completely crazy for Farina's fragrance. Grenouille completes his ingenious but murderous perfume in 1760. Giovanni Farina, however, achieved something that the loner Grenouille, who was finally arrested for his murders, was denied. Farina had recognized the sign of the times and had literally smelt the necessary change, presenting the world with a new age of fragrance. In doing so, he produced the very first brand perfume. This had consequences for the 18th and 19th century and even until this very day. The brothers Farina receive orders from all across Europe. The order books are full and have been preserved to this day. Giovanni Farina died in peace, a happy man at the ripe old age of 80 in Cologne. His legacy made Cologne a metropolis for perfume and made his brother and his descendants very wealthy. Süskind prepared a somewhat less tranquil end for his fictional character. Grenouille is torn apart by a horde of beggars and devoured. However, the success story of the Farinas doesn't end with Giovanni. There are countless others who want to have a share of Giovanni's overwhelming success. There are Farinas springing up all over Cologne, and all of them are producing some form of Eau de Cologne. Some related, others after purchasing the name Farina. Even the packaging and design are imitated. The original fragrance is now hardly recognizable in the sea of similar products, albeit only in appearance. The original secret formula for Giovanni's inheritance remains to this day a closely guarded secret. But to little effect. The growth of Eau de Cologne is now a generic international business. Giovanni Maria Farina was posthumously torn into 1,000 pieces. Another little parallel to Süskind's story, perhaps. The imitators, though, are so unscrupulous that the real Farinas have no choice other than to bring the entire matter before the courts.
There was no protection of trademarks or property rights in the 18th century. In fact, we have the family Farina to thank that since 1875 we have a Trademark Act. Since that time, one has a chance to protect oneself from plagiarism. Farina is the oldest brand of perfume, as documented since the 18th century, but it's still copied to the present day.
Despite their efforts, the Farinas didn't manage to protect the actual name of Eau de Cologne. It became instead a sort of generic name for perfumes of a sort. It is only with the addition of original that the original recipe has been protected since then. The French Revolution also led to a democratization of the fragrance. There followed numerous variations onto the market that catered for the pockets of the wider civilian population. However, many of them bared no relevance to Farina's masterpiece. As with Chanel No. 5, where an extra ingredient was introduced, or with the success of Eau Sauvage in the 60s, which had an artificial tint of jasmine, they stand as milestones within the perfume industry. They managed to create something totally new, something completely successful. For many, it was an inspiration for new creations. Chemists have worked for the last 200 years since Giovanni's death to create new techniques to better extract individual scent molecules. In doing so, they have opened up a range of new possibilities for perfumers. Coco Chanel was the first to recognize the advantages of the new techniques. She commissioned the perfumer Ernest Beau to improvise with these newly composed aromas. An entire gamut of possibilities are now open to experimentation. Individual scents are now categorized by numbers and symbols. In the case of Coco Chanel, everything centers around the number 5. Chanel was fascinated with symbols for her entire life and was very superstitious. The number 5 was no accident. The number 5 was actually her lucky number. Of course, it was the final result of the fragrance that persuaded her, but it was her belief in symbols that ultimately influenced her decision. Of all the 10 variations that her perfumer Ernest Beau presented, it was the number 5 that she went to directly. She smelt it and said, "That is my perfume." In one fated step through the legendary number 5, Coco Chanel became suddenly world famous. The magic number 5 is the symbol for human and nature. It is the symbol for perfection. Her fragrance was to become a perfume with a feminine nuance. What else but a rose can stand as an embodiment of such essentials as femininity, eroticism, and beauty? The primal rose has 5 petals, the symbol of the pentagram, the true symbol of alchemy, a fragrance filled with magic for Coco's number 5. And as this unique creation, which will turn 100 soon, was celebrated in May of 2013 in the Paris Palais de Tokyo, one can imagine that number 5, like Farina's legacy, will be celebrated for many years to come. From Audrey Tautou to Vanessa Paradis, nowadays it's always the models and actresses that influence the style of a generation. Formerly, it was to be a purveyor to court. Today, it is the stars that awake the desires of the masses. Behind every famous fragrance hides a famous story, and behind Süskind's famous story, a famous fragrance. But that should remain a secret.